I'm Don Tess, better known as the Dawn of Beer.
And I'm Em Sauter, better known as Pints and Panels.
Welcome to episode 32 of the All About Beer podcast. Every 2 weeks, we talk with leading experts and take a deep dive into one topic in beer. This week on the show, we're going to talk about diastatic issues in beer. I, as an Uber nerd, am really looking forward to this. But first, visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And this show is supported by listeners like you, so please visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others. Em, do you remember there was a big kerfuffle a few years ago about diastatic yeast strains?
I do, of course. There was a lawsuit and everything. It was quite a to-do.
It was quite a to-do, right? And in recent years, there's even talk about the diastatic power of hops.
I know, it's insane. Who knew that hops could break down complex sugars and make them available for fermentation? Wild.
Mind blown. Well, we're going to learn about those things today. Why did that beer can explode? Why do I taste diacetyl in this beer? These could be diastatic issues, and we're going to learn all about it.
I am sitting on the edge of my seat.
If you would like to help support the All About Beer podcast, please reach out to podcast@allaboutbeer.com. Speaking of supporting the show, here's a word from our sponsors.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropmaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order.
Brynn Keenan is a biochemist by training and a fermentation scientist by trade. Her experience in brewing QC includes building microbiological, sensory, and analytical programs for left-hand brewing and inland island yeast laboratories. Brynn started Grist Analytics to bring her big brewery QC tools to craft breweries by making data entry, visualization, and analysis easy. She now helps breweries across the world turn production data into actionable information. Brynn is passionate about good beer, rock climbing, and building community. Welcome to the show, Brynn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, so first, in extremely layman's terms, can
Yes,
you explain
please.
what? Can you explain what?
Explain it for people who failed chemistry.
Because one of
in
the
10th
people
grade. Thank you.
on this may have failed chemistry.
Yes.
Can you please
that is
explain
me. I
what
failed chemistry.
diastaticus is and why it can be a problem, and what makes yeast diastatic?
Yeah, absolutely. In layman's terms, so there's classic brewing strains that brewers normally use for ales and lagers, and those yeast strains can digest certain sugars, and other sugars they can't digest. So when a brewing strain can digest a sugar, it turns it into CO2 and alcohol, and at some point it gets to the point where it can't use the kinds of sugars that are left in the beer anymore, and fermentation is done. It's stable. Alcohol and CO2 aren't being produced anymore, and it's packaged and it's sent out into the world. And the difference between those strains and diastatic strains, or Diastaticus, is that Diastaticus can produce something that breaks down sugar that normal yeast can't usually digest and turn into CO2 and alcohol into a form that it can use. So sugar that normal yeast strains wouldn't be able to digest and turn into the byproducts of fermentation, diastatic strains can, because they produce an enzyme that breaks those sugars down. So they can, with the same base, with the same wort, they can produce a beer that's higher in CO2 and higher in alcohol.
Okay, thank you for that. Em, is that good?
Okay. Is it similar to like Brettanomyces then? Because Brett can break down, I know that's yeast, it's not the enzyme, but they can break down bigger sugars. So is it similar to that?
Exactly. Yeah, there are
I
tons
know.
of different.
Look at me. Sorry, I was.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's great. There are different types of yeast strains out there, and they can break down different types of sugars, which like impacts how dry the beer tastes, basically.
Got it. Okay. Yes, that made a lot of sense. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, so a few years ago, it was kind of in the news that there was this problem. Why is this a problem? Why is yeast continuing to ferment? Like, I like alcohol, so what's wrong with fermentation? That sounds pretty good to me. Why is Diastaticus a problem?
Yeah, so we've been using diastatic strains for a long time, and other strains that produce a bunch of alcohol, as I mentioned, Brettanomyces. The issue is that when you're brewing a beer that uses one of those strains on purpose, like a saison or something, you give it the amount of time that it needs to finish in tank, which is usually much longer than, say, an IPA. And that's totally okay. You give it the time it needs, it finishes out. It's got specific characteristics associated with Diastaticus. People drink it. It's awesome.
Like being super dry.
Yeah, like being super dry and phenolic, and more estery or more fruity. Yeah, they're great yeast strains to use for saisons. And when it becomes a big issue is when you're using a normal ale strain that's much different. It's less fruity. It ends up more fuller bodied since it's got more residual sugar at the end. It's not supposed to have any phenolic flavors to it. And if you get a Diastaticus contamination into a beer like that, the first issue is that it just has a bunch of flavors that you don't want, that are normally associated with saisons and that IPA. And the second issue is that, fermentation for IPAs is usually really fast, while fermentation for Diastaticus is normally quite slow. So you think the beer is done because the bulk of it ferments out really quickly, while the Diastaticus is still in there, slowly churning away at that sugar that's left. So the beers can look finished when it's actually not, and it gets packaged, and that yeast strain keeps fermenting once that beer has been packaged, which leads to a bunch of different issues.
And a bunch of different issues are.
Yeah, so you package a beer and you carbonate it, so it's at the carb level that you want to, and it's at a safe carb level, the amount of CO2 in the beer, and if there's still yeast in there that's fermenting, it's going to continue to produce CO2, which overcarbonates the package. So in the case of bottles, you can get exploding bottles, which is super dangerous. And in the case of cans, you can get deformed cans from overcarbonation and breaking cans. So it's a pretty big safety issue out in the market. And alcohol goes way up in can, which the TTB audits. So those are a couple of those big issues.
Yeah, because you can only have a 0.4 or 0.04, or something really
0.5.
low. 0.5. I think in America I thought it was 0.4.
Oh, maybe.
Differential. So if you're selling a beer that you say is 4% and you have this problem and then it's 6%, yeah, you can get in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And then I think they're cracking down on that stuff too. So you could always get in trouble, and now the trouble is getting more and more serious.
Would pasteurization stop this? If you had
so it would. It depends on where the pasteurization is happening and where the contamination is happening. So if contamination is happening in the fermenter, then pasteurization would absolutely help. If the contamination is happening during packaging, then it depends what kind of pasteurization. So flash pasteurization is usually the best kind of pasteurization to use for beer. It impacts flavor the least, but it's prior to canning. So there's still an opportunity for that contamination to happen. Tunnel pasteurization, when canned products and bottled products go through a tunnel pasteurizer, would definitely pretty much eliminate the possibility of Diastaticus issues in packaged product. But those aren't usually the kinds of pasteurization that people are looking to do.
And if you still had the phenols and you were getting other byproducts, you're going to still get those even if you're pasteurizing. So your cans won't explode, but you're still going to have some flavors of like, if I got an amber ale and it had like a lot of phenols in it, I would be like, what is this?
Yeah, you'd be like, well, this beer hasn't exploded in my face, but
Yeah.
it's still not an amber ale.
Got it.
And how quick can that happen? Like, you know, I'm a studious beer lover, so I try to drink my beer fresh. But like, are we talking within a month or a year that carbonation might be, even if my can hasn't exploded, the carbonation is going to be funny, the tastes are going to be funny, maybe there's going to be diacetyl in it because of the extra fermentation, or how quickly does any of this happen?
Yeah, it depends on the concentration of diastaticus in the beer and the kinds of sugars that are left. So if you have kind of a perfect storm of high diastaticus levels and a lot of larger chain sugars like starch left in the beer, then and you keep it warm, it could happen in days. So it's really dependent on how you store it is probably like the biggest thing with that. So either if you've stored it warm, or if the distributor stored it warm, or the truck that carried it from point A to point B was stored warm, it can actually be a really massive issue very quickly.
So how do breweries detect this? How do they know they have a problem? It sounds like it can be, I guess I'm sort of confused, like, if it can be so dramatic and so fast, how do breweries not know they have a problem? And maybe to be less harsh about it, how do breweries stay on top of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you think about it, so, okay, I said temperature was a huge element of it being a really big issue. So you're kind of at the perfect point to detect this issue after you've canned it. So at that point, you've dropped out most of your other yeast, but diastaticus may still be in solution. You have a bunch of unfermented sugar. If you introduced any oxygen to the packaged product, when this happens, that yeast can multiply. So now you have a higher concentration of yeast, and it's more active because the beer is being stored warm, and it's got a competitive advantage because it can digest this sugar, and it kind of spirals out of control. But a lot of those things aren't conditions in the brewery. So the beer is usually stored warm, usually stored without a lot of exposure to oxygen. Once primary fermentation is over, the normal yeast strain is done, it's crashed down to temperature. So it's pretty stable looking when it's in the brewery. So you're not seeing like the effects of diastaticus necessarily in the fermentation curves in the brewery. And if it's at a high concentration, you'll probably smell it. I mean, it's very detectable. So if it's at a high concentration, you know, it's pretty easy to catch at the brewery. But if it's a low concentration, it might not have affected the aroma of the beer yet post fermentation, but still at a high enough concentration that it'll be an issue in packaged product. So, like micro testing aside, it can be really tough to pick up in the brewery if it's not at a crazy high concentration. And if it's at a crazy high concentration, it's probably been an issue at a low concentration for a while.
So I guess, you know, like some of these yeast strains are hundreds of years old. Craft brewing's, you know, decades old. Why did this issue rear its head, you know, several years ago, and then seems to, like, I don't seem to really hear that much about it anymore? So why did the issue kind of die away? Like, have brewers caught onto it and now they are having better QA/QC, or what's going on?
Yeah, I think there's really a lot to that question. The other side of your last question, I think, kind of feeds into this one. Why is it so hard to detect? Before a few years ago, so we've known, and Diastaticus has been around for a long time, and scientific literature has been around on Diastaticus since the 50s. So it's not a new thing by any means, but we didn't have great ways of detecting it in the QC lab that were widely adopted until after it became this huge issue and everybody was talking about it. It's actually a bit difficult to detect for a bunch of different reasons. It's very genetically similar to normal yeast strains. So the PCR that people were doing before Diastaticus became this huge thing was not detecting this variation because it looks so genetically similar to typical ale strains. So that's one element. The other one is one of the easier ways to detect Diastaticus is with LCSM media, which really wasn't popular yet before it became a big issue, and we didn't know a lot about it. But it has a ton of limitations to it. It detects a bunch of strains that aren't actually diastatic. It doesn't detect some strains that are diastatic. We don't actually really even know why Diastaticus can grow on LCSM. So yeah, it's actually kind of a tough one from a micro testing standpoint. So I think that was probably why everybody was so afraid of it for a while, is it can have these really horrible consequences in the market. And we just didn't know a lot about how to detect it and what concentrations were going to be an issue when it was happening. At the same time, craft beer is taking off and everybody's using these cool new Saison strains and doing funkier stuff and mixing clean beer with wild beer and kind of like mixing all these yeast strains in the same cellar. So I think the problem really became amplified through the course of like the popularization of craft beer since we started using those strains more for production.
Oh, I see. Em, did you have any questions?
I do actually. So if I'm a small brewery with like no lab, it's just me and a couple of my coworkers, and this problem arises, or I have a small facility, like, do you have any tips or suggestions of how small breweries or even home brewers can manage yeast? Is it just clean, 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 and making sure your yeast health is good? I mean, are there any tips or tricks that people who are small brewers or home brewers should know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think good cleaning is definitely number one. So you should never have a contamination. I mean, yeast really shouldn't even be contaminated with anything, much less something that could spoil a beer. And that stuff is totally avoidable with good cleaning practices. So on the home brewing side, good cleaning practices for sure, 100%. And then on the industrial brewing side, again, it really shouldn't be an issue if the brewery's got good SIP and CIP and cleaning practices. So getting those practices audited, making sure that there are no like dead legs and the piping, making sure that you've done the calculations on the length of your piping and the speed of your pumps to make sure you're getting enough force to actually clean your piping. Regular audits on your rinse water after CIPing to make sure there's nothing alive in there. And even if you don't have an in-house micro program, you can validate that stuff by taking a sample and sending it into a lab every now and then. So maybe you can't afford to test on every beer, but you can probably afford to send a couple samples a few times a year and make sure that you're cleaning your tanks properly.
You mentioned, sometimes you can smell it, and I think you're referring to like phenolic aromas or whatever. Are all diastatic strains Saison strains? If I am a home brewer that only makes IPAs and never use Saison strains, maybe this isn't a concern for me. Or are there diastatic strains that in all styles?
Yeah, there are some diastatic strains that are POF negative, which means that they wouldn't produce phenolic off flavors. So yeah, you're not quite safe by just looking for phenolic off flavors.
Everybody should care is really what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah, everybody should care. And there are some, this is like kind of a niche thing, but I guess to the advice that I'd give a smaller brewer and a home brewer too, there's a really specific fermentation curve that these strains often exhibit, where they'll go through primary fermentation really quickly from your main yeast strain. And then you'll see this long trickling fermentation at the end that never really settles out. And that's pretty classic Diastaticus.
Ooh, okay.
So when you say long trickling, like if I were to take a gravity reading today and then 24 hours later take another gravity reading, will it have changed in 24 hours, or are we talking weeks or?
Yeah, like maybe. It usually it changes. It'll change by like 0.1 from day to day Play-Doh. But sometimes it'll be stable for a couple days and it'll drop 0.1 Play-Doh the third day.
Wow.
Yeah, like very, very slow.
Okay.
Are there any other hallmarks of Diastaticus that people should be looking for if it's not phenolics? Like, is there, I guess it would be like diacetyl would show up again places like later in the firm, or am I like, or are there other hallmarks?
Yeah, that might happen from, like that. Yeah, that, and not, like not the same way that a contamination would evolve diacetyl, but like if you have Diastaticus and it goes through a growth phase in the can, you probably get some diacetyl from that first, like it produces diacetyl during that growth phase. So you might get some diacetyl. So I don't usually associate that as being like the biggest tell aromatically. What else? Yeah, gushing out in the market, like when, customer complaints that have anything to do with like esters or aromatic compounds that don't belong there, or gushing beers. I mean, gushing can come from a bunch of different stuff, but that's usually a pretty common one that you'll hear for diastatic contaminations, just from that overcarbonation.
Yeah, because it's gonna keep making carbonation. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I forgot to mention too, I was just working with a brewery that didn't have a micro program off the ground, and they were really worried about diastaticus contaminations. So I had them just take packaged cans and bottles and put them in an incubator for a few days after it was packaged, and then check alcohol and CO2 and make sure alcohol and CO2 were the same as when they packaged them. So that can be a cheap way to test for these over attenuating strains without a lab at a brewery too.
Okay.
That's getting them nice in the trunk of your car,
Yeah. Store beer, like
yes,
the bulk of Americans store beer, and then
yes, in the trunk of your car in August in Texas, and see what happens.
I have heard of breweries that will take some beers from each canning run and like stick it next to their boiler. If you basically do force it to be hot, I guess. Is that effective?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, we did that. I've done that several times too, because there's not a ton of space in an incubator. So even if you got one, it can be more like less annoying to use the boiler room or stick it next to the boiler to get it up to temp.
Right. Just put it in a box first, because you don't want that can exploding next to you.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so my understanding is that these diastatic yeast strains have a specific gene, which I think, and I'm surprised we actually haven't used the phrase yet, but STA1, I believe, is the gene. And I understand that there are some yeast companies that are taking diastatic yeast strains and removing or somehow editing. I'm not a geneticist, obviously. Somehow they can take the STA1 out of otherwise diastaticus strains. What are your thoughts? Does that actually solve the problem? Does that create other problems? False confidence, anything? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know that much about it, but I mean, that seems like a great idea. If you're on board with genetically modified yeast in brewing, it seems like a great solution to a problem. No, I don't think that would be a false sense of confidence, especially since these days we have a lot of great ways of testing if it can actually, get through starch. So as long as they're being tested afterwards, that seems like a really cool solution.
Okay. Awesome. Em, did you have any last questions?
I learned so much because I, again, failed chemistry. I'm going to keep telling everybody that. I'm going to mention it like 50 times in this episode. And I really struggle with different yeast strains and whatnot. And the fact that there's an issue out there that like I'm not super known about, and like it's almost like it's like silent but deadly. Not like that's a gross fart thing, but you know, but it feels like it could be if I ran a brewery or was a home brewer, like this could be a huge problem. And then it also is a problem for customers because you know you're going to get this great beer that you love, and then this isn't right. Or you know I've stepped on an exploding bottle in the middle of the night. That's very
Really?
painful. Yes, I have. Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Wow.
Don't store your bottles. This was when I was just getting into beer. I stored some bombers on their sides and then stepped into it in the middle of the night on my way to
Ooh.
the bed. Yeah. So don't store beer on sides.
So many takeaways from
Yes,
today's podcast.
a lot of takeaways. Don't store beer on their sides. You know, make sure to keep your beer refrigerated. And it's something you should, you know, if you're a customer and you have a beer that you're like, this is odd, please tell the brewery.
Yes, I agree.
100%
Yeah.
tell the brewery. You know, it's important. It's not, it could be it could be bad draft lines or it could be a ton of other things, but breweries want feedback if their beer,
If they care, yeah.
if they care, they want feedback. And so I think this is a good episode. Good takeaway is alert your local brewery if you think something is a mess. So
I guess I will lead. That does make me think of one last question for you, Brynn. Do you have any idea? Like, I think a lot of consumers are afraid to raise a fuss. They don't want to seem difficult. I think sometimes they're also uncertain of their own knowledge, and so don't want to say, "Oh, I think this beer is off. I'm not sure." So do you have any sense of how big of a problem this is? So if I'm a consumer and I think I might have a problem, am I probably right or am I probably wrong?
Well, I feel like if you're a consumer and you have a thought about your beer, there's no reality in which that thought's not valuable to the brewery. Even if I think sometimes like we think that we need to be an expert on something to provide feedback, but from doing quality control for breweries for a really long time, it's so much more endearing and helpful for somebody to send an email and say, hey, I think this wasn't quite right, and here's what it tasted like, just so you know, rather than somebody supposing what was wrong with it to us. Like it's actually way less annoying for someone to come in thinking they don't know what exactly is wrong with it than knowing all the answers. So it makes us all better to get that feedback. And you know, even if you I'm all for sending feedback on the contact form for breweries rather than like a Google review or an Untapped review.
I was gonna
Like
say Untapped is the QA QC essentially de facto. Because I've worked at breweries where X amount of bad reviews that you would look at X amount of bad reviews and you'd be like, okay, there's an issue with this bar or this run.
Yeah.
And that was Untapped can be a very good way to like alert, but it's also you know it also is because you're also like telling everybody except really the brewery, I didn't like this.
Right.
This could be an issue when you're not, you know, a nice polite email like, hey, I had a beer at this place at this time. It tasted like this. Like I you know, I've had this beer before and it's not what I'm used to. And like breweries want to, you know, make sure that they're putting out I would hope the best beer possible. And so write your email to the brewery. Don't, you know, Google, 1-star Google reviews. Not gonna.
I do like that, Brynn. I want to thank you for that. I think if nothing else from this episode, that one takeaway that QA/QC will actually appreciate helpful comments that are not know-it-all-y. I think that's great. So thank you for that, Brynn. Brynn, how can people keep up to what you're doing? Social media handles, website, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, awesome. I own a software company called Growth Analytics now, but tracks production data for craft breweries. So if you want to follow us on Instagram, we're at Grist Analytics. We've got some good cooking up good memes. We've got some educational material that we put out pretty often. If you want to get on our newsletter, we're gristanalytics.com. And basically, I am Grist Analytics. So I don't really have a personal handle.
Okay, awesome. Thank you,
Nice.
Brynn.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really very enlightening about yeast and all sorts of stuff. So we
I bet you
appreciate it.
could pass chemistry now, Em.
I don't know. I'll ask Mrs. Duvall, but I don't think so.
Mrs. Duvall, if you're out there,
yeah,
we give them another chance.
I think she may listen to this podcast actually. But yeah, maybe I'll ask her.
Awesome. Thank you, Brynn.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And now a quick break for a word from our sponsors.
All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order.
Tom Nielsen began his professional brewing career at Sierra Nevada Brewing Company in 2004 after obtaining a Bachelor of Science in Food Science and Technology from Rutgers University in New Jersey. Tom was the initial hire in the newly minted Research and Development Department at Sierra Nevada. For nearly 20 years now, Tom has been highly involved in all aspects of brewing quality, method and process development, and brewing innovation. In January 2014, Tom began building the Raw Materials Department at Sierra Nevada, focusing primarily on procurement, development, and quality of hops and malts and new product development. In July 2018, Tom added the Research and Development Department to his Sierra Nevada Brewing Company management responsibilities. Tom serves as Sierra Nevada's representative to the American Malting Barley Association, the Brewing and Malting Barley Research Institute, the German Society of Hop Research, the USA Hop Research Council as an ex-president, and the Hop Quality Group as technical chair. Welcome to the show, Tom.
It's a pleasure to be here, Don. Thank you for having me.
So we are talking about diastatic issues, and specifically, we wanted to talk to you about diastatic issues around hops. So can you kind of explain what the issue is? And I don't know if hop creep is a common term, but does hop creep apply to all diastatic issues around hops, or is that just one aspect? Or I guess hop creep 101 is, I guess, what I'm asking you.
So I guess, by diastaticus, you mean just the drying out of the beer as much as possible. So, some yeast strains have the ability to ferment out higher sugars, polymers of glucose and so on and so forth into fermentable form, thereby drying the beer out. And in hops, the diastaticus is largely an amylase enzyme like you would get from malt, particularly during the mashing step in brewing, right? Just to be clear, that's how you're defining diastaticus.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
And I guess I understand hops have some of this power to, I don't know if it's actually amylase.
The freshening power of the hop. Yes,
yeah.
I'm very well aware of it. So it is true. Hops, when they're added cold side post boil, have the ability to break down polymers of carbohydrates. So basically higher sugars, things that typical yeasts, typical Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeasts will not ferment, so they won't touch them. And these have largely been identified as amylase type enzymes, not dextrinases. So there's a whole slew of different enzymes that will break down these higher sugars, and the ones that are typically found in hop, to my knowledge, and per the latest research, published research, are that they are amylase enzymes. So they are there. And when you dry hop, they start acting on the carbohydrates or polymers of glucose that you leave behind, through the brewing process, things that you probably want for mouthfeel, and certainly non-fermentables, things that will not be fermented and increase alcohol, CO2, and other things. So dry hopping typically occurs, midway or at the end of fermentation, at which point you're reinfusing this liquid, this fermenting wort or beer, with fermentables, with glucose largely, and maltose, and you're kind of breaking down, those higher sugars into the fermentable types. So you're basically giving more food to the yeast, and you're starting a whole nother, if fermentation's already done, you have the potential to kind of restart a fermentation, almost as if you're doing like a bottle conditioning or something like that, or a secondary conditioning. Mm-hmm. So yes, this is happening. I think diastaticus is, certainly a term that you can use to describe it. I think a lot of us describe it as hop creep, because it's kind of a multidimensional description of what's going on. I think that creep, that word creep, can be applied to increasing alcohol and increasing carbonation. And it slowly creeps up. And certainly probably even with the flavor impact, you have diacetyl that can creep up, and then it takes a long time for it to go away. So it kind of just creeps forever. So my sense is that's how that term got popularized, because there's this slow kind of creeping effect to the fermentation if the enzymes from the hops have been activated and have created more fermentable sugar substrate for the yeast and for whatever's in there to act on.
And if it gets bad enough, will there be enough CO2 that it could actually cause cans to rupture or things like that?
I think that is a minor risk, and it's been written about quite a bit. If you do fully break down all the dextrins, all the non-fermentable carbohydrates left over in a beer, and then ferment those all, you could have a very high CO2 content and internal pressure in the cans and bottles. I mean, for the integrity of the glass or the aluminum, should withhold quite high CO2 volumes, but if there's an imperfection, say in the glass, which there could be, you could have an event where you have an exploding bottle. It's actually not too uncommon in home brewing, where there's a lot of sugar added back to the bottles for carbonation step and the bottle conditioning procedure. So that's not completely rare in the home brewer circle to have exploding bottles.
Yeah.
But in trade, in a commercial product, that should be a non-starter, really. So we look at that very closely. Okay. But the CO2 will increase if there's hop creep occurring and there's some active, or if there's some yeast carried over into the package. Yes.
And then how bad? And obviously, I know it will depend on how much dextrins are left in the finished beer before hop creep starts. But like, let's say we have a 5% beer and that alcohol creeps up. Like, could we? Like, it's presumably not going to 10%. Like, how bad of a problem?
No.
Could it be?
I mean, you could go from being in specification for alcohol. So the spec for alcohol is plus minus 0.3% ABV. So say if you have a 5% beer, it can actually be legally between 4.7 and 5.3. It can go above the 5.3 if you start at the 5, theoretically, which is a problem because all of a sudden you have beer that is out of spec, and there's some risk to having that out on the shelf just from a TTB compliance point of view.
Okay. So in addition to, I guess, alcohol creep, then it also possibly causes more sensory problems like diacetyl or other fermentation byproducts.
For sure.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. The one I'm really personally sensitive to is acetaldehyde.
Okay.
I can usually pick up what I perceive to be some minor hop creep when a beer has a little bit of acetaldehyde. If I know if it's a double IPA or it's been dry hopped a couple times, and I pick up a little bit of acetaldehyde, which to me would be like a kind of a pumpkin guts type of note. That's probably, that's the clue to me that there's a little bit of hop creep happening in this package. Now, hop creep can be very pronounced very quickly, or it can be very slow and drag on for months after packaging too. So there's kind of a spectrum of hop creep that can occur. I think in extreme would be when you get basically a whole nother fermentation starting late into your tank cycle, and you get a diacetyl spike and it just hangs up there high. And you basically have beer that you can't sell because the diacetyl is too high. Another scenario is that the beer's fine all throughout the tank cycle, and you package it, you filter package it, but over the course of its lifetime in the can or the bottle or the keg, I guess, if you do back pitch a little bit of yeast, you could have this very slow kinetic creep going on for months and months. So both of those can sort of happen and will happen if you have dry hopping and a little bit of yeast in the same system.
Right. And you wouldn't even necessarily have to back pitch yeast. I mean, it could be just that if the beer's unfiltered or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. It won't take much yeast to get it to go.
Em, do you have any questions? I'm nerding out with Tom here.
No. Well, you are a big nerd, so that makes sense. I wanted to ask about, I know they're different, but maybe because I just want a little more clarification. What's the difference between biotransformation and hop creep? Because those are two phrases or words that get bandied about a lot in industry circles. And I'd love a little clarification of the difference between both of them.
Well, they are quite different, and I wouldn't myself think of them in the same sphere. Like the Venn diagrams don't really overlap much there. Although I guess they could, but I think it's best to think of them differently before you start kind of putting them together. So biotransformation is basically how the yeast and the metabolism of the yeast or the fermentation really impacts mostly flavor molecules or flavor active molecules in the hop itself. Okay, so there's already a fermenting, a media where it's fermenting. There's already wort. There's already plenty of sugar. You don't really need hop creep for biotransformation to happen. So biotransformation is when the yeast will metabolize certain components in the hops and liberate flavor active molecules. So one example are the thiol compounds, right? Everybody talks about thiols these days. So polyfunctional thiols are present in high concentration, but in a bound form, actually, when they're bound to different peptides or proteins. And at some point, the yeast may go after these proteins just for its own metabolism and kind of free up the flavor molecule, the grapefruit or tropical note that is bound to that protein or peptide, thereby making it flavor active. Another common biotransformation, I don't know if common is the right word, another popular biotransformation pathway involves when the yeast takes hold of some of the monoterpenes, the monoterpenic alcohols, and biotransforms them into a similar molecule that has an even more potent flavor and aroma. And this is very well researched with the molecule geraniol. And geraniol can be changed a little bit by the yeast to create something like citronellol. And then there's a whole pathway down there, and citronellol is more potent than geraniol, and it's got, you know, more bright sensory aspects to it. So those are the two most commonly thought of biotransformation pathways. Hop creep, you know, if it happens later on in fermentation, when this has already happened early in fermentation, is just another, you know, maybe a little bit more biotransformation is occurring. Maybe a lot. I can't really cite too many research projects I've done or in the literature that directly correlate hop creep post or secondary or even tertiary fermentation to more biotransformation. Usually hop creep is thought of as a negative aromatic event where you get a lot of diacetyl and acetaldehyde. You almost get the beginning components of a stressed fermentation because not a lot of nutrients are there. You know, you just get a little bit of sugar. You just get the yeast to kind of wake up a little bit and produce some metabolites that, if you had a nice, strong, complete fermentation, it would naturally uptake those negatives and you know, and get them down to lower levels, acceptable levels.
So I'm not a brewer and I'm not a scientist, but as you were explaining that, I was thinking, you know, in the biotransformation, if the yeast is freeing the thiol by taking the protein away, is that during the yeast growth stage that it wants the protein? And then if that's the case, then because there's so little yeast when the hop creep is happening, maybe it wants to grow, maybe it wants the protein, maybe it does create more biotransformation because it wants the protein. Question mark?
Yeah, no, it could. You're exactly right, but there's not going to be enough there to create a complete fermentation.
Okay.
So my point is, you're just gonna like have a stalled, unhealthy fermentation with a lot of diacetyl, a lot of acetaldehyde, probably H2S, which is the eggy note. So those are all negatives. You know, at that stage, the liquid or the beer, it doesn't have everything it needs to really, you know, there's no oxygen. There's all these things that, you know, really are required to start a fermentation off in a healthy, positive way, and then you got to take it to completion to have all the positive effects. Yeah,
right.
When it all happens over the course of 2 months, very slowly, you know, it's not ideal from a commercial standpoint.
Right.
And maybe after those 2 months, you'll have the best beer that has ever been made. But certainly, when you're trying to, you know, keep thousands and thousands of consumers happy with a stable product and a consistent product, that's not the way to go.
Right. So hops have been used in beer for centuries now. So why did this issue kind of come up only relatively recently, like just a few years ago is when I first heard about it?
There was a paper published in 1896 in the UK that it was a really well-written paper. It's amazing to read some of the scientific literature of that era and how well written and researched it was. So this paper by, is it Horace? No, Horace Grant is power forward for the Chicago Bulls in the 90s and 2000s. Horace something. Geez, I forget his name. It's so silly of me that I don't remember the name. But anyway, really cool paper written in 1896 that like outlines hop creep in detail. So they discovered it in the UK when they were shipping a lot of beer, you know, to India with the dry hops in the casks. So the original India IPA. And then again in the mid 40s, 1940s, there was another researcher that published on hop creep again. And I think that researcher's name was Janicki. So, it seems like every 50 years or so, the topic comes up. This time around, we won't we won't kind of let it lie. There have been probably 40 or 50 research papers, maybe, written on hop creep in the last 10 years. But I really attribute Allagash Brewing Company from rediscovering the phenomenon. They're a company that is really hyper focused on yeast health, and they have really good fermentation metrics that they use in their brewery to make their white. They started dry hopping for the first time like 12, 13 years ago, and they immediately noticed something was wrong.
Oh.
And they threw up a bunch of red flags because nothing was making sense, and their fermentability and their RDFs were off and their alcohols were off, and they're like, what is happening here? And they got really excited about it, and it really got the whole industry excited about it. I think Bell's jumped on and early and did some interesting work. OSU and the Shellhammer teams and his students over the years have published excellent work on hop creep and continue to do so. I think in the latest ASBC journal, they published a nice paper on hop creep. So I started at Sierra Nevada in 2004, and we always saw a little bit of extra fermentability in Celebration Ale, and a little bit of like CO2 going up a little bit, but it was never so concerning that we threw a bunch of resources at trying to figure it out. We just, kind of maybe. Anyway, Celebration would come and go so quickly and be so frantic that we never had time to really
Well, and it's bottle conditioned
dive.
anyways, too, right?
That too. And that was
Right.
another kind of thing that was hiding the hop
Right.
creep.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So we were looking for where all these fermentables were coming from. And, I don't think we ever answered it, but we just kind of left it on the table because it wasn't an immediate concern for us. But yeah, I am sure that as a whole, well, here's the other piece too. Sierra Nevada, up until more recent times, we were all whole cone brewing.
Yeah.
The hop creep occurs at a much higher extent when you're using pelletized hops or hops that have been ruptured and broken up.
Oh.
So yeah, whole cone dry hopping actually creates a lot less hop creep. You extract less of the enzymes into your liquid. So it's really more like that long, slow, well into months into the package that we'll still get a little bit of creep. We never saw this problem during the tank cycle in the cellar where we had a bunch of off flavors. That's more of a phenomenon that happens with like T90 pellets, and a lot of like the modern IPA brewers experienced that problem, very seriously, I would say.
Right. Okay, so you mentioned that hop creep happens with cold side hop use, so dry hopping. Sierra Nevada, you mentioned you were aware, I guess, a little bit of the issue, and you do a lot of dry hopping. You're famous for your hop torpedo and everything. So how do you manage, or how, not just how Sierra Nevada specifically, but how can breweries manage hop creep?
I think there's a lot of ways to like stack ideas to minimize the impact. There is no silver bullet. If you're using T90 pellets, I think you're at high risk. One of the ways we kind of get around the major effects of hop creep is by using concentrated pellets, or just lupulin powder, which kind of subtracts a lot of like the leafy material and the stem material. It subtracts any seed content that were in those hops. And actually the seed is known to have quite a bit of the hop creep amylase enzyme as well. So yeah, that's one technique, is just to use like the T45 pellet or I guess some vendors call them cryo pellets or CGX. But typically they're known as a T45 pellet. Yeah, there's aside from that, I can't really come up with too many other solutions.
Pasteurization, I guess.
Vinny
Right?
Trilurzo from Russian River and I give a talk on hop creep in March of 2023 at the California Craft Brewers conference, and we had a whole slide or two outlining ways to mitigate hop creep.
Okay. Em, do you have any questions?
I do. So what should, like, if I'm a beer drinker, what can I do? So if the issue is accelerated by like temperature, I know that I should keep my IPAs in the fridge, but I mean, should I really make sure that everything stays cold, or is that not helpful, or is it going to
keep it cold? Yeah.
Okay.
Colder. Yeah, cold is always better.
Is there
for
anything
sure.
else? Yeah. Is there anything else I should be doing, or customers or beer drinkers in general?
Drink a lot more of it and a lot higher throughput.
Just
drink as fast as possible. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Those chug videos are for a reason, everybody.
No, not that.
I'm joking,
in moderation. But
please drink in moderation. No, obviously, I'm team moderation.
No, not really. Keeping the beer cold is the best thing, I would say. A lot of us have take home growlers and crowlers and things like that. Make sure you're, so those are inherently going to have a little bit of oxygen during the filling and capping process. So make sure you keep those cold and then drink them within, the stated time, a day or two.
Right. Okay.
Fresh is best. Got it.
No silver bullet. It's a natural product. Hops are a natural ingredient, and and that's what makes it part of what makes it so great. So
it's an issue people just need to be aware of, but otherwise, all the more reason to drink cold and fresh.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Anytime.
Okay, Em, what was your big takeaway?
That you're a huge nerd. And that this is, I'm really glad that we did a show that are for the dons of the world. Because this show was like the nerdiest thing we've ever done. Because the thing that I took away from it was the crazy aspect of science in beer is something that cannot be ignored.
And we're still learning. Like, I mean, yes, the hop creep thing came up, in 1896, but really it was under the radar for the last, 100 years until a few years ago. And also with yeast, like, I mean, we've been using these yeast strains for hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden we have this issue, and it's a scientific thing. Like, how do we? Yeah, there's still new science in brewing, which is what
that's the thing that I took away. Like, there's still so much to learn, and so much that we're learning with the fact that what are we using? 4 ingredients,
right?
And when people have been brewing for what? Thousands upon thousands, millennia. I don't know, like a long time. Yeah. And we're still talking about these things. We're still learning about why they happen. It's really, really cool. It also makes me excited about the future of beer and what things will happen, with science and what we'll discover and what new things and new styles will come out because of it. It's cool. It's very cool. It's really nerdy, extra nerdy. So the dons of the world, this episode is dedicated to you.
I would like you to do a pints and panels of hop creep.
I'm gonna need your help because again, I failed chemistry and I took away enough where now I'm like, oh, okay. But then my bad science brain immediately forgot. So we can draw that together. That would be wonderful.
And everybody else, please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And if you're feeling generous, please visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others. If you have questions for the experts, please email us podcast@allaboutbeer.com. That's also the email for feedback, suggestions, or to inquire about supporting this show through advertising. Em, how can people reach out to you?
I am at Pints and Panels across all social media, and my website is www.pintsandpanels.com. How about you, Don?
I am at the Dawn of Beer on X, Threads, and Instagram, and people can drop me an email at dawn@thedawnofbeer.com. Here's a word from our sponsor, but keep listening for a teaser about our next episode.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order.
Em, if you could pick any topic for our next episode, what would it be?
You know, I really would love to talk about cellaring beer.
Wow. Do I have good news for you? Our next episode is about cellaring beer.
What? Oh, I love it. That's good. Great news.
Yes, a quick shout out to @WanderingShame on X, who actually suggested this episode topic. And if you have ideas for an episode, please reach out to us. We love to hear from all of our fans. This show is produced by All About Beer. Visit allaboutbeer.com for articles, notes on this show and others, and to connect via the newsletter and social media. Cheers.
Don's a huge nerd.